At its peak, the A.C. Gilbert Company employed 3,000 workers in a New Haven factory stretching across 500,000 square feet. They built erector sets from real steel girders, brass pulleys, and electric motors, toys so well engineered that one was used to prototype the Bailey Bridge and another powered the precursor to the artificial heart. Then the founder died, and the decisions began. A Hollywood investor who owned Lassie bought the company for $4 million. Executives from Scott Paper and Union Carbide replaced every salesman who knew the business. 50 new products launched in a single year, none of them wanted. The steel girders were redesigned into flat strips. The painted metal boxes, 30 years of brand identity, were swapped for cardboard. The flagship set was slashed from $75 to $20. By 1967, the brand was given away for $0, and the factory fell silent. The broadcasting tower that once spelled Erector against the skyline was knocked down by wind a decade later. This is the story of how A.C. Gilbert, Olympic gold medalist, Yale-trained doctor, master magician, and the man the press called the man who saved Christmas, built a company that taught American boys how to make things, and how everything he built was dismantled by men who understood nothing about what they'd bought. Not through a single disaster. Through one reasonable decision after another, each one stripping away something that couldn't be put back. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Wouldn't Stop. The story begins in Salem, Oregon in 1884 with a boy who scared the hell out of his father. Alfred Carlton Gilbert was the middle of 3 sons born to Frank Gilbert, a banker, a strict Congregationalist, a man who dedicated entire Sundays to religious devotion and expected his household to do the same. Frank Gilbert observed daily family prayers. He believed in order, stillness, and the careful management of risk. He got AC instead. The boy was frail as a child, small-boned and sickly, and he responded to this the way he'd respond to every obstacle for the rest of his life, by attacking it head-on until it surrendered. He rebuilt himself into what one reviewer later described as a toy bulldog's body. 5'7", 135 pounds of coiled, restless energy packed into a frame that never stopped moving. His father watched all of this with what Gilbert's autobiography would describe as puzzled pride, emphasis, you suspect, on the puzzled. Because here's what puzzled pride looked like in the Gilbert household. Young A.C. converted the family barn into a working fire station, not a pretend one. He installed a pole through the haymow floor, set up cots, rigged 110 feet of garden hose, and then paid a neighbor kid to set brush fires in the surrounding lots so he could practice emergency response. Around age 11, his father snatched him from an upper window seconds before the boy attempted to demonstrate what he'd advertised to the neighborhood as Salem's first parachute jump. Around the same age, he ran away with a traveling minstrel show, billing himself as the champion boy bag puncher of the world at $15 a week. His father retrieved him after 1 week. As Gilbert later wrote with the magnificent shamelessness that would define his entire career, I knew what my parents would say, so I didn't ask them. That instinct. Do it first, explain later, and if they don't understand, build something so good they have to admit you were right. That instinct built everything that followed. Gilbert attended Tualatin Academy in Forest Grove, Oregon, where he met a girl named Mary Thompson. He then enrolled at Pacific University, where he won over 100 athletic trophies and ribbons and, at 17, broke the world record for consecutive chin-ups, beating a mark that had stood since 1888. He could climb a 25-meter rope in 7 seconds, which was also a world record. He broke the distance record for the running long dive. The boy, who'd been frail and sickly, had turned himself into one of the finest all-around athletes on the Pacific coast. Then he enrolled at Yale Medical School, class of 1909. His thesis title, The Genito-Urinary Phenomena of Athletes. He earned his MD. He never practiced a single day of medicine, because somewhere between the anatomy lab and the gymnasium, A.C. Gilbert had discovered two things that interested him considerably more than kidneys. The first was magic. He'd been fascinated since boyhood, when he saw the great Herrmann perform at the Reed Opera House in Salem, and at Yale he'd turned it into a business, performing at the Hyperion Theater and at private parties to finance medical school. While courting Mary Thompson, he'd put one arm around her and practice card tricks with his free hand. The second thing was building, making. The irresistible pull of mechanisms and materials, of gears and motors, and the satisfaction of something that works. And in New Haven, Connecticut, he found a partner who shared both obsessions. Chapter 2. Gold Medal Steel Girders. John Albert Petrie was a machinist 14 years Gilbert's senior, the son of a manufacturer, and one of the finest builders of magical apparatus in the country. He'd previously run a company called, with the innocent obliviousness of the pre-war era, the Swastika Magic Company. A mutual friend introduced him to Gilbert around 1907, during Gilbert's final year at Yale, and the two clicked instantly. The athlete showman and the precision craftsman, the front man and the toolmaker. Their company, Misto Manufacturing, was formally incorporated in 1911, with Gilbert's father, Frank, providing the crucial $5,000 in startup capital and serving as a director. They made magic sets, professional quality apparatus for aspiring magicians, advertised in The Sphinx, the trade magazine of the conjuring world. It was a good small business. It was about to become something else entirely. But first, there was the matter of the Olympics. Gilbert's athletic career at Yale had been extraordinary. He won the Intercollegiate Wrestling Championship at 135 pounds. He won the AAU Junior Pole Vault title. In 1907, he achieved a four-way tie for the IC4A Pole Vault title, all four vaulters from Yale. He'd revolutionized the event itself, inventing both the spikeless bamboo pole, which replaced the dangerous hickory poles with metal spikes that vaulters had been using for decades, and the pole vault box, a hole dug in the ground to plant the pole, which is now universal in the sport. The origin of the box was pure Gilbert. As a boy in Lewiston, Idaho, with no proper equipment, he'd grabbed a split rail from a farmer's fence and dug a little hole in the ground because he didn't have a spike. Necessity, invention, and the absolute refusal to wait for permission. By 1908, he held the world record at 12 feet, 8 inches, and he arrived at the London Olympics as the overwhelming favorite. The British officials banned his bamboo pole. They prohibited digging a hole. Gilbert bought a hatchet and tried to dig one in secret. He was caught. He demanded the rule book be read aloud. When the officials still said no, he competed with archaic, heavy equipment he'd never trained on, equipment that made him feel, in his own words, as awkward as a calf. He cleared 12 feet 2 inches anyway, the best mark in the finals. He shared gold with fellow American Edward Tiffin Cook, Jr. of Cornell, in the first tied pole vault gold in Olympic history. Cook reportedly told Gilbert to attend the medal ceremony alone. That's the man. Told the rules don't apply to what he's built, so he fights the rules, loses the fight, competes under someone else's conditions, and wins anyway. He went on to coach Yale's Sabin Carr to the world record and Olympic gold at the 1928 Amsterdam Games, served as chef de mission for U.S. Olympic teams at the 1932 and 1936 Games, and authored the Encyclopedia Britannica article on pole vaulting. But by then, pole vaulting was the least of what A.C. Gilbert had built, because in the fall of 1911, staring out the window of a commuter train, He saw something that changed the American toy industry forever. Gilbert was riding the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad between New Haven and New York City. The railroad was electrifying its main line, converting from steam to electric locomotives to access the new Grand Central Terminal. And workers were erecting steel tower girders to carry overhead power lines along the route. Gilbert watched the latticed steel going up, girder by girder, and the idea hit him with the force of a revelation. From his autobiography, "I thought how fascinated boys might be in building things out of girders, and later, I tried to put 4 girders together to make a square girder like those on the railroad. It wouldn't work until I made a lip along the edge. This little invention was probably the single most important factor in the success of Erector." That night, he and Mary sat at their dining room table cutting miniature girders from cardboard, working out sizes, openings, and angles. He took the prototypes to a local toolmaker and had them fabricated in steel. The key innovation, a bent lip along the edge of each flat strip that allowed 4 pieces to lock together into a strong, hollow, square girder, was what made these toy parts look and behave like real structural steel. It's what separated them from everything else on the market. The Eli Whitney Museum's assessment of the origin story is worth noting. Gilbert didn't claim to have invented the steel construction toy. Frank Hornby was already marketing his Meccano sets in England when Gilbert visited London for the Olympics in 1908. What Gilbert claimed, and delivered, was the realism, the lifelike girder, the feeling of building with actual steel. The patent was filed January 20th, 1913, and issued that July. In May 1912, Gilbert and his father had outvoted Petrie at a directors' meeting, selling the Misto building and machinery to finance the pivot to construction toys. Petrie sold his stock to the Gilberts and was effectively pushed out of the company he'd co-founded. He later started the Petrie-Lewis Manufacturing Company in 1916, which became one of the finest magic apparatus makers in the country, operating until 1968. But the magic business was behind A.C. Gilbert now. Ahead of him was something much bigger. The Erector Set debuted at the 1913 New York Toy Fair at the Broadway Central Hotel. It came with something no other construction set in the world offered, a real electric motor. See Chapter 3, Hello Boys. "Hello Boys, make lots of toys." That was the slogan, splashed across the pages of the Saturday Evening Post and Popular Mechanics in what became the first major national advertising campaign for a toy in American history. And the boys of America answered. By 1916, just 3 years into production, A.C. Gilbert was selling $750,000 worth of Erector sets and magic sets for a net profit of $100,000. The company was reorganized that year as the A.C. Gilbert Company, and Gilbert co-founded the Toy Manufacturers of America and became its first president. In 1917, he opened the world's largest toy factory, a massive brick complex at 319 Peck Street in the Fairhaven neighborhood of New Haven, on a site that had been the Maxim Munitions Works. He called it Erector Square. And from those floors, the product line expanded into territory no toy company had ever attempted. Chemistry sets with manuals co-edited by Yale Sterling professor Treat Baldwin Johnson, microscope sets, glass blowing kits, caster kits where boys poured molten metal into molds to cast their own toy soldiers, electrical sets, optics sets, physics kits, mineralogy sets, civil engineering and surveying equipment, crystal radio sets, wireless telegraph sets, puzzle sets, tool sets, and eventually the product that would become even bigger than the Erector Set itself. But first there was a war to fight and a Christmas to save. After America entered the First World War in April 1917, the Council of National Defense began converting civilian manufacturing to military production and considered banning toy production outright. The argument: citizens should spend their money on war bonds, not playthings. Gilbert, as chairman of the Toy Manufacturers War Service Committee, traveled to Washington in late October 1918 for a meeting in the office of Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels. He was given approximately 15 minutes. He brought a satchel full of toys: submarines, trains, picture books, air rifles, products from manufacturers across the industry. He tried to hide them behind his leather bag as government personnel passed in the hallway. A naval guard inspected the toys before he could bring them into the room. And then A.C. Gilbert, the former magician, did what magicians do. He made serious men play. His argument, reported in the Boston Post on October the 25th, 1918. The American boy is a genuine boy. He wants genuine toys. He wants guns that really shoot. And it's because of the toys they had in childhood that American soldiers are the best marksmen on the battlefields of France. Secretary of Commerce William Redfield picked up a miniature steam engine and confessed, "I learned the rudiments of engineering on an engine like this." Secretary of the Interior Franklin Knight Lane picked up an aviation book. Gilbert's 4-word assessment of the meeting: the toys did it. The Boston Post ran a photograph of Gilbert with his Erector Set, captioned, "The Man Who Saved Christmas." The nickname was bestowed by the press at the time, not a retroactive invention. A C. Gilbert, the boy who'd run away with a minstrel show and jumped from windows with homemade parachutes, had talked the United States government out of canceling Christmas. During the war itself, the Gilbert factory produced gas masks, bomb casings, chemical suits, and bayonets. During the Second World War, the conversion was even more dramatic. The plant manufactured parachute flare casings, documented in February 1942 by Library of Congress photographer Howard R. Hallam, and small trim-tab motors for fighter planes, designed in a remarkable 72-hour engineering sprint. But the most extraordinary wartime contribution drew directly on the company's expertise in magic tricks. The Gilbert factory produced 90% of all firing devices used by the Allies in landmines, anti-personnel devices, and sabotage explosives. A toy company's knowledge of hidden mechanisms and concealed triggers, repurposed to win a world war. The company received multiple Army-Navy E awards for excellence, an honor earned by only 5% of war plants. And that 72-hour motor? The tiny device designed in a sprint to adjust fighter plane control surfaces? After the war, it became the prototype for the Pullmore, the motor that powered American flyer trains. Gilbert had acquired the American Flyer brand in 1938 from W.O. Coleman for $500,000, moving production from Chicago to New Haven. After the war, he made a decision that train collectors still debate with religious intensity. He switched American Flyer from 3-rail O-gauge track to 2-rail S-gauge. Lionel's 3-rail track had a toy-like center, 3rd rail running down the middle. Functional, but it didn't look like anything you'd see on a real railroad. Gilbert's 2-rail S-gauge looked like actual track. Miniature rails on miniature ties, proportioned like the real thing. By the early 1950s, American Flyer had become the company's largest-selling product line, surpassing even the Erector Set. And then there was the product that nobody today quite believes existed. In 1950, the A.C. Gilbert Company released the U-238 Atomic Energy Laboratory. Priced at $49.50, roughly $660 today, it contained 4 glass jars of actual uranium-bearing ore, a Geiger-Miller radiation counter, a cloud chamber, a spinthariscope, an electroscope, a 60-page manual by physicist Dr. Ralph E. Lapp, and a comic book titled Learn how Dagwood split the atom, co-written with General Leslie Groves, the director of the Manhattan Project, and physicist John R. Dunning. The whole thing was certified safe by Oak Ridge Laboratories. Fewer than 5,000 units were produced. Complete examples now sell at auction for as much as $16,500. It was insane. It was magnificent. And it was pure A.C. Gilbert, a man who believed that if you put real science, real engineering, and real tools into the hands of American boys, they would build the future. Over his career, he accumulated more than 150 patents. He co-founded the industry's trade association. He convinced the federal government to let toys exist. He won Olympic gold. He ran a factory that made everything from toy trains to the firing mechanisms in Allied landmines. He held a medical degree he never used because building things was more interesting than fixing people. By the early 1950s, the A.C. Gilbert Company was the most respected name in American toys. Chapter 4. The Cathedral of Making. The complex at 319 Peck Street sprawled across 5.5 acres of the Fairhaven neighborhood, 11 brick buildings, 3 stories each, totaling roughly 550,000 square feet. It sat between the Mill and Quinnipiac rivers, about 2 miles east of the New Haven Green, and a railroad siding ran directly into the complex for receiving raw materials and shipping finished goods. Above it all rose a steel broadcasting tower, home to radio station WCJ, Connecticut's first licensed broadcasting station, a tower that spelled Erector vertically against the skyline. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what those buildings contained. Herb Pierce started at the Gilbert factory as a model maker and rose to superintendent of all production departments. His oral history, published by the University of New Haven, describes an operation of staggering self-sufficiency. Over 30 production departments, every one of them under the same roof. The big press department, where steel strip stock was fed into stamping presses that punched and bent the iconic flanged girders with their regular pattern of holes. Screw machines that could turn out parts, Pierce recalled, within 1/10 of 1,000ths of an inch. A massive die-casting department where furnaces roared with molten zinc alloy poured into molds for American Flyer locomotive bodies. Plastic molding, printing, plating, nickel baths where parts were dipped and finished, painting, wire forming, welding, woodwork, and a box-making department that produced the iconic red metal cases that Erector Sets came in. Cases that were themselves substantial, collectible objects, heavy in the hand, conveying quality before you even opened them. The sensory world of that factory floor was overwhelming. The stamping presses thudded in a rhythm you could feel through the soles of your shoes as steel was punched and bent into girders. The screw machines whirred at a higher pitch. Precision work, tight tolerances, the sound of metal being shaped to specifications that would make the gears mesh and the pulleys turn. Die-casting furnaces roared as zinc alloy went from solid to liquid to the body of a locomotive in a matter of minutes, and behind it all was the chemical tang of the plating baths and the acrid edge of enamel wire coating. Gilbert held the patent for enameled wire insulation, a process designed to prevent overheating in small motors, and it was the company's most important industrial contribution outside of toys. The cedar scent of the smoke pellets used in American Flyer locomotives permeated the entire building. A sweet, woody note underneath the machine oil and hot metal, so distinctive that workers' families could smell the factory on their clothes when they came home. Gilbert was the largest manufacturer of fractional horsepower motors in the world. The company also made consumer appliances, electric fans, coffee percolators, toasters, humidifiers, and juice extractors under the Polar Cub brand. And on the first day of electric mixer production, 700 units vanished from inventory. Every worker on the line took one home. Even the fly specimens packed with the microscope sets came from the Gilbert dairy barn that supplied milk for the company lunch break. All those processes, the stamping, casting, plating, painting, printing, wiring, assembling, converged on a conveyor system where the final product came together. An Erector Set that started as a coil of steel strip stock at one end of the plant emerged at the other end as a boxed, labeled, finished toy containing heavy steel girders, brass pulleys, precision gears, a real electric motor with forward and reverse operation, nuts and bolts machined to real tolerances, and an instruction manual printed on site. Every component made under one roof. Nothing outsourced. Nothing imported. The quality was the brand's soul, and the brand's soul was manufactured right here, on Peck Street. The workforce that made all of this came from the streets surrounding the plant. Fairhaven was an immigrant neighborhood, Irish families who'd arrived from the 1830s, giving the area its early nickname of Little Dublin, followed by Germans, then Italians arriving from southern Italy, beginning in the 1880s, then Poles, Lithuanians, and Russian Jews. Many lived within walking distance of the factory gates. Home pieceworkers, many of them women, assembled small components like set screws on erector gears and pulleys in their houses on the surrounding streets. The very avenue the factory sat on, Blatchley Avenue, had been developed in 1866 by Samuel L. Blatchley, who built affordable homes specifically for workers. The neighborhood and the factory had grown up together. They were, in a sense, the same thing. Gilbert wore old gabardine suits and rubber-soled shoes, and carried a pipe he sometimes stuck into his pocket while it was still lit. He punched the time clock alongside his workers every morning and stood in line with them. He visited the night shift every week. He called his workers co-workers, never employees, and he meant it, or at least he acted as though he meant it, which in practice amounted to the same thing. He pioneered benefits that were virtually unheard of in the era: paid maternity leave, free medical advice, free legal advice, a company credit union established in the mid-1930s, and a Christmas party for workers' children every year. The result, as Herb Pierce put it, no union could make headway at the A.C. Gilbert Company, not because workers were afraid, because they didn't feel the need. Outside the factory gates, Fairhaven thrived. Grand Avenue, the main commercial street, supported 4 movie theaters, bakeries, butcher shops, fish markets, bars, over 20 furniture stores, a post office, and a firehouse. Gilbert, along with Sargent's Hardware, Bigelow Boilers, and National Folding Box, powered the neighborhood economy. Churches anchored every block: St. Francis R.C., Grace Episcopal at Blatchley and Exchange, St. Rose's, St. Donato's. The neighborhood's population reached nearly 24,000 in 1930. Families walked to work in the morning and walked home for supper, and the rhythm of the factory whistle organized the day for everyone within earshot, whether they worked at Gilbert or not. The Gilbert Hall of Science opened at the intersection of Broadway and Fifth Avenue in New York City on September the 17th, 1941, a 6-story building designed by architects Élie Jacques Kahn and Albert Buchmann that functioned as part science museum, part product showroom. Massive American flyer train layouts occupied entire floors, including a 16 by 92-foot display on the second floor used for television filming. Superman visited in a comic book. The hall operated for 17 years. Meanwhile, the Gilbert Institute of Engineering for Boys, not a physical institution but a brilliantly conceived loyalty program, let boys earn certificates by building Erector models and selling subscriptions to the Erector Tips newsletter. Local branches organized at toy stores drew huge turnouts. In Olean, New York, in 1916, over 600 boys showed up for a single meeting. Annual design competitions drew more than 60,000 entries, with prizes that included Shetland ponies and, in 1915, a two-seater Trumbull automobile. And the product itself? Engineers and scientists would spend decades crediting it with shaping their careers. Henry Petrosky, the Duke University professor of civil engineering, wrote that many engineers over 40 spent their formative years playing with metal construction toys. A General Motors engineer used an Erector Set to prototype an automated piston casting machine. A Disney Imagineer used original metal components to prototype a ride at California Adventure. And during the Second World War, Sir Donald Bailey built the original scale model of the Bailey Bridge, one of the conflict's most vital military engineering innovations, praised by both Eisenhower and Montgomery as among the war's most important inventions, using a number 10.5 Erector Set. The bridge that helped liberate Europe was prototyped with a children's toy. In 1949, William Sewell and Dr. William Glenn of Yale School of Medicine used an Erector Set motor to build a heart bypass device that successfully functioned for over an hour on a dog. A toy motor spinning inside a machine that kept a living creature alive. The precursor to the artificial heart, born from a Christmas present. That was what A.C. Gilbert had built, not just a toy company, a machine for turning American boys into American engineers. And by the early 1950s, it was the most respected enterprise of its kind in the world. Chapter 5. The Summit. They couldn't see annual revenue peaked at approximately $20 million. The factory employed up to 3,000 men and women. Over 30 million cumulative Erector Sets had been sold. American Flyer trains were the company's largest product line. International subsidiaries operated in London and Toronto. The A.C. Gilbert Company was ranked by independent assessment as the top producer of learning toys in the world, a position it had held for more than 50 years. Gilbert himself had become a figure of almost improbable accomplishment. Olympic gold medalist, founder and first president of the Toy Manufacturers of America, the man who saved Christmas, holder of over 150 patents, a man who bred champion German shepherds, won the Max von Stephanitz Award, and shot, by his own accounting, almost every important type of American game, and lived on a 600-acre estate called Paradise in Hamden, Connecticut. He published his autobiography in 1954, The Man Who Lives in Paradise, co-written with Marshall McClintock. And the title wasn't ironic. He meant it. He told the New Yorker, "I guess my life hasn't been anything to set the world on fire. But it's been interesting, and I know this. I've had more fun than the average boy." But there's a detail from 1953 that stops you cold. In a profile conducted at the absolute zenith of his $20 million a year empire, A.C. Gilbert admitted, "It's harder for me to think of creative things. These used to tumble out of my mind." The man who'd built the world's largest educational toy company on the principle that toys spark the creativity America needs, that engineering begins in a boy's hands, that the urge to build is the urge that built the country, was confessing that his own creative engine was slowing down. He was 69 years old. He'd been running at full speed since he was 11, since the fire station in the barn and the parachute from the window and the minstrel show at $15 a week. And now, for the first time, the ideas weren't tumbling out anymore. He retired the following year. He handed the company to his son, Alfred Carlton Gilbert, Jr., Yale class of 1941, engineering degree, wartime service at General Electric designing naval ordnance, a qualified man on paper. But there was no formal succession plan. There had never been one, because A.C. Gilbert had never truly believed anyone else could run what he'd built. He became chairman of the board in 1956, and he couldn't let go. He told an interviewer in 1952 2 years before his nominal retirement. I'm willing to let Al worry about new cost accounting systems, time studies, and finances, and run the business. But I'm going to have plenty to do and say about engineering, new inventions and products, promotion and advertising, packaging, and co-worker relations for many years to come. I'm not going to be an inactive chairman of the board. His son's response, preserved in the record with the quiet frustration of a man who'd spent his adult life in his father's shadow. Dad gets frustrated because he still can't run the whole show, but he never stops trying. A father who couldn't let go, a son who couldn't take hold, and a company that had been built around one man's restless, relentless creative energy. Energy that, by the founder's own admission, was finally running down. The Gilbert Hall of Science in New York closed in 1958. Herb Pierce, the legendary plant superintendent who'd risen from model maker to overseer of all 30 production departments, left the company in 1957 at the age of 40. Key personnel were departing. The fundamental Erector Set design hadn't changed dramatically since the 1910s. American flyer trains faced a contracting model railroad market as the space age steered boys' imaginations away from engineering and toward fantasy. The company still relied on print advertising, in-store demonstrations, and catalogs directed at parents, the same strategy that had worked for 4 decades. Meanwhile, in 1955, a married couple in California named Ruth and Elliot Handler bet their entire company, every dollar Mattel was worth, $500,000 in net assets, on something no toy company had ever attempted: year-round television advertising. A 15-minute segment on Walt Disney's Mickey Mouse Club, 52 weeks a year. Ads aimed not at parents, but directly at children. For the first 6 airings, nothing happened. Then the Mattel offices couldn't open the door. The place was filled with orders. By 1962, Mattel's ad budget had reached $5.7 million. Annual sales approached $80 million. They'd surpassed longtime leader Louis Marx to become the biggest toy maker in the world. Ruth Handler's Barbie debuted in March 1959. Hasbro's G.I. Joe followed in February 1964, selling nearly $17 million in its first year. Television was absorbing the leisure time that had once gone to hands-on construction play. Pop culture licensing was exploding. The Gilbert boy, the young engineer in training hunched over a half-built Ferris wheel, was being replaced by the action figure collector and the child staring at a screen. A C. Gilbert's philosophy had always been parent-directed: education, engineering, the serious business of building. That philosophy was now a liability, and the man who'd held it all together through sheer creative force and personal magnetism was fading. On January 10, 1961, Alfred Carlton Gilbert suffered a coronary seizure at his New Haven home. He traveled to the Leahy Clinic in Boston and showed initial progress. On January 23rd, a setback. On January 24th, a massive pulmonary attack killed him. He was 76. His front-page New York Times obituary was extensive. Sports columnist Arthur Daly wrote, "A C. Gilbert never quite separated himself from the world of the small boy. He was a rare one." The company was still viable, still producing, still employing thousands of workers in those brick buildings on Peck Street. But the man who'd held it all together was gone. And what came next would destroy everything he'd built. Chapter 6. The Inheritance. Alfred Carlton Gilbert Jr. was 41 years old when his father died, and he'd spent most of his adult life trying to become the man his father already was. Yale class of 1941, engineering degree, wartime service designing naval ordnance at General Electric in Schenectady. He'd entered the family business around 1946 and assumed the presidency sometime in the early 1950s. Sources disagree on the exact year, which tells you something about how blurry the handoff was, because A.C. Gilbert Sr. never really handed off anything. He retired in title. He kept his hands on the controls in practice, and the dynamic that resulted was in the assessment of Stephen D. Goldberg of the University of New Haven, a textbook case of family business dysfunction, a father unable to relinquish power, and a son unable to claim it. Goldberg's analysis, based on interviews with Gilbert family members and former employees, is blunt. Too much was handed to him because he was his mother's son, and along the way he never developed the traits of an astute businessman. The continuing dependency, Goldberg wrote, damaged the son's own sense of self-esteem. No formal succession plan existed. The founder had once said, with the casual self-awareness of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, "What I'll probably do is compromise and become chairman of the board. I'm afraid I'd feel lost if I dropped out of this race." So here was the A.C. Gilbert Company in January 1961. The founder dead, the son overwhelmed, the market shifting beneath their feet, and the company's stock concentrated in family hands that now owed inheritance taxes. The family needed to sell, and the buyer who appeared was everything A.C. Gilbert was not. Jack Rather was born in Amarillo, Texas, in 1918. He grew up in Tyler, graduated from the University of Texas at Austin cum laude in 1939, and his wealth came from oil. Specifically, his mother's investments in the oil business, managed through his father's Overton Refining Company. He'd served in the Marines during the war, commanding an air group in the Philippines across 3 campaigns. His first marriage, to the daughter of a Democratic governor and U.S. Senator from Texas, ended in divorce in 1945. In 1947, he married Benita Granville, a former child actress with an Academy Award nomination. By the early 1960s, Rather had assembled an entertainment empire consolidated as the Rather Corporation. He owned Jack Rather Pictures. He owned the complete rights to The Lone Ranger and Lassie. He owned Sergeant Preston of the Yukon. He owned Muzak, the company that piped background music into elevators and department stores across America. He owned TV stations in Tulsa, San Diego, and New York. He owned the Disneyland Hotel. Walt Disney himself had asked Rather to build it when Disney ran out of credit, and Rather then refused to sell it back. Disney didn't get the hotel until 1988, 4 years after Rather's death, when the Walt Disney Company bought the entire Rather Corporation to get it. Goldberg described him as a wealthy bon vivant, comfortable among the Hollywood set, a man who once loaned Richard Nixon a bus for campaigning. The connection between the two families was the Young President's Club, an elite business networking organization where Gilbert Jr. and Rather had met. After the elder Gilbert's death, with the family needing cash for inheritance taxes and the younger Gilbert struggling, Rather saw an opportunity. Not a toy company, a leisure company, a piece of a broader entertainment conglomerate fitting alongside Lassie and Muzak and the Disneyland Hotel. The logic made sense on paper. Americans were spending more on leisure, and the Gilbert brand was one of the most recognized names in America. In 1962, the Rather Corporation purchased all 144,000 shares of Gilbert family stock for $4 million, roughly $40 million in today's money. Goldberg calls it a distressed sale, the classic outcome of failed succession planning. A C. Gilbert Jr. took the ceremonial position of chairman of the board. The man who owned Lassie now owned the Erector Set, and the first thing he did was fire everyone who knew how to sell one. Chapter 7. Paper Tigers. Jack Rather's first act was to install his own management team. Not one of them had ever sold a toy. William Quinlan became president of the A.C. Gilbert Company. He was a personal friend of Rather's and a former vice president at the Rather Corporation. He replaced Harvey Roth, who had significant toy industry experience. Quinlan had none. Quinlan brought in Ben Moats as vice president of merchandising. Moats came from Scott Paper Company. He had sold paper towels. He had never sold a toy. Moats brought in Ron Richards as sales manager. Richards came from Union Carbide. He had sold industrial chemicals. He had never sold a toy. Richards, in turn, brought several junior salesmen from his previous career, men who knew how to move commodity products through industrial distribution channels and knew nothing about the toy business, its seasonal rhythms, its buyer relationships, or the peculiar psychology of selling a product that a child has to want and a parent has to approve. In a single stroke, the accumulated expertise of decades, Harvey Roth's industry knowledge, the relationships between Gilbert's sales force and toy buyers across the country, the institutional understanding of how the American toy market actually worked, was replaced by men from the worlds of corporate entertainment, paper products, and industrial chemicals. Herb Pierce, watching from the outside, he'd left in 1957, 3 years before the founder's death. Put it simply, they sent people in who didn't know anything about the toy industry, and they manufactured a lot of products that weren't up to standard. I think in the first year of operations, they lost about $3 million, something that had never happened before in the 50-year history of Gilbert. $3 million in a single year from a company that had been profitable for half a century. That's what happens when you hand an enterprise built on engineering, craft, and deep market knowledge to men whose qualifications are friendship with the owner and experience selling products that have nothing in common with toys. But losing $3 million was just the beginning. The decisions that followed were worse. Rather's team set an organizational goal of $20 million in sales for 1963, matching the company's all-time peak despite starting from a position of weakness with an inexperienced management team, a demoralized workforce, and a brand that hadn't been refreshed in years. To hit that target, they made a bet that defied every principle A.C. Gilbert had built the company on. They introduced 50 new product lines in less than 12 months. 50. Using engineers and production departments that had no training in the new categories. The company that had spent 50 years speaking to boys who wanted to build things suddenly tried to sell to girls, to preschoolers, to toddlers. Markets where Gilbert had zero brand recognition, zero expertise, and zero credibility. Products included a chemistry of plating and paint set with girls on the packaging, an awkward gesture toward a demographic the company had never addressed and didn't understand. The Honey West action figure, a female private detective TV tie-in, sat on shelves alongside Erector Sets, as if the same buyer who wanted a steel girder construction kit would naturally reach for a doll based on a television show. Robert Hartley's Marketing Mistakes, a standard business school textbook, includes the Gilbert case as a chapter. The company diluted the company name and ruined its reputation by expanding into girls' toys, infants' toys, and cheap discount market items. A brand built on one promise, real tools for real building, was now promising everything to everyone and delivering nothing of quality to anyone. The 1962 catalog had already signaled the philosophical abandonment. For the first time in the company's history, airplanes were featured on the front pages. Erector sets and trains, the products that had built the company, the products that meant something, were relegated to the back. And then, on November the 22nd, 1963, a bullet in Dallas destroyed the company's last best hope. Chapter 8. The Bullet and the Cardboard Box. Rather had developed a relationship with Marvin Glass, the legendary Chicago toy inventor whose firm, Marvin Glass and Associates, was the most prolific toy design house in America. The plan was for Gilbert to buy Glass's products and promote them with a major television advertising campaign for Christmas 1963. The company's first serious attempt at the kind of TV-driven marketing that had made Mattel a giant. President Kennedy's assassination on November the 22nd threw the country into mourning. Toy sales collapsed. Networks pulled back from toy advertising during the national grief. The planned campaign was gutted. Simultaneously, a consignment deal with Quaker Oats Company failed badly, returning a disastrous backlog of unsold stock to Gilbert warehouses. A planned cross-promotional deal with Pepsi-Cola never materialized. Both Quinlan and Moats resigned effective January 1st, 1964. The New York Times reported their departure on December 19, 1963. They'd been running the company for roughly 18 months. In that time, they'd launched 50 products that nobody wanted, lost money for the first time in the company's history, and set fire to the brand's reputation in markets where it had no business competing. Now they were gone, leaving the wreckage for someone else to sort out. And 6 months later, the wreckage got worse. On June 27, 1964, Alfred Carlton Gilbert Jr. died of a brain tumor at Grace New Haven Community Hospital. He was 44 years old. The founder's son, overwhelmed, outmaneuvered by Rather's management team, stripped of real authority in the company that bore his family's name, was gone just 3 years after his father. 2 Gilberts dead in 3.5 years. The family that had built the company no longer existed inside it. Rather installed a new CEO, identified in multiple case studies as Isaacson, and the decisions that followed would finish the job. Here is what they did to the Erector Set. The iconic girders, 5/8 of an inch wide, trussed, flanged, looking for all the world like miniature structural steel, were eliminated. In their place, flat strips with evenly spaced holes on half-inch centers. Bruce Hansen of the A.C. Gilbert Heritage Society described it plainly in the Gilbert Erector Set guidebook. Gone was the trussed girder look. The system was redesigned to be more Meccano-type, redesigned, in other words, to resemble the very British competitor that Gilbert had defeated and absorbed decades earlier. The signature models that had defined the brand for generations, the parachute jump, the carousel, the Ferris wheel, had to be dropped entirely because the new parts couldn't build them. You couldn't build them. The geometry was wrong. The strength wasn't there. The parts that had made an Erector Set no longer existed. The painted steel boxes were next. For 30 years, from 1932 to 1962, Erector Sets had come in heavy metal cases, painted red or green or blue, that were themselves objects of substance. You picked one up and it had weight. It meant something. It said, "What's inside this box is built to last." The boxes were replaced with cardboard. The flagship set was slashed from $75 to $20, not repositioned. Gutted. The quality cuts required to hit that price point were visible to anyone who'd ever touched an original. The Heritage Society's verdict on the redesigned sets. These sets are not typically sought after by collectors, which is the polite way of saying they weren't worth keeping. American flyer trains suffered the same degradation. Quality was reduced across the line to compete on price, a race to the bottom in a market where Gilbert's entire identity had been the refusal to cut corners. Dies and tooling weren't maintained. For the first time in the brand's history, motors were sourced from Japan. The signature worm drive motor that had been manufactured on Peck Street since the 1930s was gone. The result was predictable. Returns skyrocketed. Retailers who'd trusted the Gilbert name for decades started sending product back. And then the sales force was gutted. The entire in-house team, men who'd spent years building relationships with toy buyers, who knew the seasonal rhythms of the business, who understood that selling a toy is different from selling paper towels or industrial solvents, was replaced by independent contractor manufacturers' representatives. These were commission-based agents who represented several non-competing toy lines simultaneously. They pushed volume. They had no interest in maintaining or building the long-term relationships that had sustained the brand for 50 years. A 1963 photograph, believed to be the last time the Gilbert sales force ever gathered in one room, documents the final meeting. Over 30 men, including Al Ormsby, who'd been with the company since 1946, and Bob Schanzer, both of whom left the following year. Ray Losi had already departed in 1963. A company built on personal service and deep customer knowledge was stripped of everyone who provided either. Consider the sequence. In less than 3 years, the new ownership had replaced the experienced management with men from unrelated industries, launched 50 products that failed, lost millions for the first time in half a century, saw 2 of its 3 top executives resign in disgrace, lost the founder's son to a brain tumor, redesigned the flagship product into something its own customers couldn't recognize, replaced steel with stamped flat strips, replaced painted metal boxes with cardboard, slashed prices by 70%, sourced foreign motors for a brand built on American manufacturing, fired the entire sales force, and replaced it with commission agents who didn't know the company's name from any other line in their catalog. Each decision in isolation had a logic. Cut costs, broaden the market, compete on price, use modern distribution. Each one was the kind of decision that executives from Scott Paper and Union Carbide and the Rother Corporation would naturally make, because those were the worlds they understood. They were applying the playbook of commodity consumer goods to a brand that had never been a commodity. They were treating the Erector Set the way you'd treat a roll of paper towels, as a product defined by price and shelf placement, rather than by the thing itself. And the market's verdict was swift and total. Chapter 9. The Last Christmas. In 1965, desperate for relevance in a market that had passed them by, the company placed its remaining chips on pop culture tie-ins. James Bond 007 action figures based on Sean Connery in Thunderball, Moon McDare astronaut figures, the Honey West figure, Man from UNCLE figures, and the centerpiece, a James Bond 007 road race slot car set, designed by Marvin Glass and Associates and sold through Sears. The slot car set was a particular catastrophe. Tire cutters extending from the hubcaps, a gimmick meant to replicate the Bond film's gadgetry, proved defective. Every set shipped with a note telling children the feature had been removed. A toy that arrived with a letter of apology in the box. Quality control failures produced massive returns from Sears, and returns from your biggest retail partner don't just cost money. They destroy the relationship. The retailer that sends your product back is the retailer that doesn't reorder. And due to internal chaos and a workforce that had been cut to a skeleton, the new product lines weren't delivered to stores until after Christmas. After Christmas. In the toy business, where an entire year's revenue depends on the 8 weeks between October and December. The product arrived in January when nobody was buying toys. It sat in warehouses. It was returned. It was written off. Production of American Flyer trains ceased in 1966. The trains that had been Gilbert's largest selling product, the trains with the realistic 2-rail track that had earned the fierce loyalty of a generation of hobbyists, stopped coming off the line. The dies went cold. The assembly floor went quiet. The A.C. Gilbert Company, having lost money every year since 1962, declared bankruptcy in 1967. Walter E. Heller and Company, a major commercial finance firm that had been handling accounts receivable for both Lionel and Gilbert, acquired the remains. Heller determined the company could not emerge from bankruptcy as a viable enterprise. It was dissolved in early 1968. The Erector Set brand went to Gabriel Industries. The price was $0. Gabriel paid nothing. They agreed to a promise of future royalties based on sales. One of the most iconic brand names in American toy history, a name that had been synonymous with engineering, with building, with the idea that American boys could make anything, was given away. American Flyer was transferred to Lionel in May 1967, and the terms were almost as bleak. No cash changed hands. Lionel agreed to sell $300,000 to $400,000 worth of existing American Flyer merchandise sitting in warehouses, and in exchange received the tooling and original artwork, decades of engineering heritage, the physical molds and dies that represented the accumulated craft knowledge of an entire workforce. Lionel stored that tooling outdoors, exposed to the elements, and the company didn't reintroduce the American Flyer brand for 14 years. 4 months after acquiring Gilbert's train line, Lionel itself went bankrupt. The toy train market that had sustained two American giants was collapsing in on itself. The massive complex at 319 Peck Street, 550,000 square feet, 11 buildings, 30 production departments, the place where 3,000 men and women had once stamped steel and cast zinc and plated brass and assembled the toys that taught a generation of American children how to build, went silent. The 125-foot broadcasting tower that had once spelled Erector vertically above the Fairhaven skyline stood for another decade, abandoned until a windstorm knocked it down on January 9th, 1978. Nobody rebuilt it. Chapter 10. What the silence replaced. Gilbert's closure was not an isolated wound. It was one cut in a hemorrhage that nearly killed New Haven. The city's factory wage earners numbered 9,300 in 1972. By 1987, that had dropped to 5,700. By 1992, to 3,500. By the early 2000s, roughly 2,500, a loss of more than 90% of factory jobs from the post-war peak. Fairhaven's manufacturing employment alone collapsed from 34,500 in 1947 to 14,500 in 1980. The neighborhood that had supported 4 movie theaters, 20 furniture stores, bakeries, butcher shops, and a commercial life rich enough to sustain nearly 24,000 residents. That neighborhood, in the assessment of the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute, disintegrated. Gilbert was not alone in falling. Winchester Repeating Arms, established in 1866, New Haven's other signature manufacturer, followed a parallel arc of decline, labor disputes, and eventual closure in 2006. Sargent Hardware closed. Bigelow Boilers closed. The broader pattern, as Nicholas Dawidoff wrote in The Other Side of Prospect. It was only when deindustrialization devastated New Haven that such places of opportunity and uplift declined into isolated communities of struggle. Fairhaven's Grand Avenue, the street where 4 movie theaters once lit up the evening and families walked to work in the morning, became something else. The furniture stores closed. The fish markets closed. The bars that had served Gilbert workers their Friday evening beers closed or changed hands. The churches held on longest, St. Francis, Grace Episcopal, St. Donato's, anchoring blocks whose commercial life had drained away. Bill Kramer, a Korean War veteran who'd taken a job at Gilbert in the early 1950s as an apprentice to the model train repairers, left the factory to become a New Haven police officer in 1956, serving until 1984. He'd seen the writing on the wall early enough to get out. Not everyone could. The Erector Set brand began a long, strange journey through other hands. Gabriel Industries produced cheaper versions through the mid-1970s. introducing the plastic parts that many people associate with the Gilbert decline. Though the literal shift to plastic happened mostly after the bankruptcy, under Gabriel's ownership, not under Rather's. Gabriel continued using the Gilbert name through 1976, trading on a reputation that the actual Gilbert Company had already destroyed. The brand passed to CBS Toys, then to Ideal, then to Tyco. And then, in a twist that carries a weight almost too perfect for fiction, the Erector Set was purchased by Meccano, the French company that manufactured the original British construction toy that A.C. Gilbert had defeated and absorbed in the American market back in the 1920s. The competitor he'd buried came back and bought his name. In 2013, the Toronto-based toy company Spin Master acquired Meccano, including the Erector brand. In January 2025, Spin Master licensed Meccano to Addo Play, a British company for long-term development. The last Meccano factory, in Calais, France, closed in 2023. The product is now entirely imported, a toy that was born from an American watching American workers erect American steel girders on an American railroad, built by American hands in an American factory for American boys, is now owned by Canadians, licensed to the British, and manufactured overseas. American Flyer's journey was equally circuitous. General Mills purchased Lionel's product line in 1969. In 1985, Richard Kuhn, a Detroit toy train collector, bought the brands, and rock star Neil Young became a minor investor, designing the Rail Sounds audio system that made model locomotives sound like the real thing. Today, American Flyer exists as Lionel LLC's brand name for S-Gauge offerings. Many of the products are reissues manufactured using original Gilbert tooling from the 1950s. The same dies and molds that Lionel once stored outdoors in the rain. The tools survived. The company that made them didn't. The factory buildings at 319 Peck Street survived too. After Gilbert closed in 1967, the Gardella family from Norwalk, Connecticut, purchased the complex, subdivided the floors, and began renting to artists. They named it Erector Square. In 2004, the property passed to developer Capi Amodio, who continued the renovation. Today, the complex is Erector Square Studios, home to over 175 studios in 8 of the 11 original buildings, housing more than 150 artists, architects, musicians, designers, and dance, theater, and fitness professionals. The Collective Consciousness Theater performs where die-casting furnaces once roared. Music Haven, a youth education program, teaches strings in rooms where screw machines once turned out parts to tolerances of 1/10,000th of an inch. A letterpress shop called Dexterity Press occupies space where the company's own printing department once ran. A luthier named Kevin Chapin builds guitars. Sarah Kennedy runs a ballet school. Fresh Yoga holds classes. B at 315. Cafe serves coffee. Each fall, the community holds citywide open studios. The artists open their doors in the exact spaces where workers once assembled Erector Sets and American Flyer trains. Visitors walk through studios with north-facing windows where the light falls on canvases and easels, in rooms built for assembly lines and steel. 7 miles away in Hamden, the Eli Whitney Museum and Workshop maintains the primary A.C. Gilbert archive and collection. Director William Brown and curator Walter Zawalich preserve what remains. Every year, from Thanksgiving through January, the museum displays vintage American Flyer trains that, in the museum's own words, still run beautifully after 50 years. In 2013, they mounted an exhibition called The Erector Set at 100, What to Make of It. In Salem, Oregon, Gilbert's Discovery Village Museum opened in 1989, honoring the founder's memory in his birthplace. The collector community keeps the rest alive. The A.C. Gilbert Heritage Society maintains extensive online archives, product guides, and a 72-page Erector Set guidebook compiled by Bruce Hansen. Annual conventions draw members who bring assembled creations, 5-foot Eiffel Towers, working Ferris wheels, bridges, and cranes, built from parts stamped on Peck Street 60 or 70 years ago. Over 2,000 vintage Gilbert listings appear on eBay at any given time. Complete U-238 atomic energy labs sell at auction for as much as $16,500. Even a common Erector Set in decent condition fetches several hundred. The steel holds up. That's the thing. The girders Gilbert designed in 1911, stamped in his factory, packed in his painted metal boxes, they don't corrode, they don't warp, they don't snap. A child who received an Erector Set in 1952 can hand it to a grandchild today, and every nut will thread, every gear will mesh, every pulley will turn. The product was built to outlast the company that made it, and it did. Chapter 11. The Silence in the Wrong Shape. C. Gilbert built a company on a single conviction: that if you put real tools into the hands of American boys, real steel, real motors, real gears, they would teach themselves to build. Not toy building, real building. The kind of building that raises bridges and wires cities and sends rockets into the sky. He believed this because he lived it. Because a boy with a split-rail fence post and a hole in the ground had turned himself into an Olympic champion, and a cardboard model cut at a dining room table had turned into the most famous toy in America. For half a century, it worked. The Erector Set didn't just sell, it mattered. Engineers who designed bridges and power plants and assembly lines traced their first spark to a red metal box full of steel girders and a motor that actually ran. The Bailey Bridge was prototyped with one. The precursor to the artificial heart was powered by one. Secretary of Commerce William Redfield picked up a toy steam engine in 1918 and confessed that he'd learned the rudiments of engineering from one just like it. The toy taught the engineers who built the country, and the country they built was, in a real and measurable sense, the product of a man who never stopped being a boy. After Gilbert died, the men who took over his company understood none of this. They saw a brand name and a revenue target and a factory full of costs to be cut. They replaced the steel with flat strips. They replaced the painted boxes with cardboard. They replaced the salesmen who knew the business with commission agents who didn't. They replaced engineering with TV tie-ins and slot car gimmicks and action figures based on shows that would be canceled in a season. They took a company that had been profitable for 50 years and lost money every single year they ran it. And when it was over, when the bankruptcy was filed and the assets were divided and the brand was literally given away for nothing, the factory on Peck Street still stood. It stands today. The same 3-story brick walls, the same windows, the same floors that once shook with the rhythm of stamping presses. The railroad siding is overgrown. The broadcasting tower that spelled Erector against the sky is gone, knocked down by wind 45 years ago. Inside those walls, where 3,000 workers once built toys that taught children how to make things, artists paint, and dancers rehearse, and a man builds guitars by hand. The work is quieter now. The scale is human rather than industrial. The light through the north-facing windows falls on different kinds of making, but the making continues. That's what A.C. Gilbert might have understood if he could see it, that the building doesn't stop just because the assembly line does, that the impulse he spent his life feeding, the urge to pick up raw material and turn it into something that wasn't there before, doesn't die when a company dies. It just finds other hands. The Erector Set was never really about the toy. It was about the boy holding it, the one who looked at a box of steel parts and saw a bridge, a Ferris wheel, A machine that could do something no machine had done before. That boy is still out there. He just doesn't know what an erector set is. And that, the not knowing, that might be the heaviest thing of all.